Hi, and welcome to The Greatest Lies in History, a riveting podcast that dives deep into the world of con artists who manipulated historical narratives to their advantage, who forged fake documents and pretended to be people that they are not. They lied and many believed. I'm your host, Kimberly Desmond.
And I am your co-host, Patrick Pichler. We are two history students from Vienna with a love for all things that deal with historical scandals and controversy. Each episode of this podcast unpacks the integrate schemes, the psychology behind deception, and the consequences of these fabrications on our understanding of history. It explores how lies can shape societies, influence politics, and alter the course of history itself.
Welcome back to this week's episode where we will discuss another great scandal. Tonight, we are diving into the infamous forged Hitler diaries. Coincidentally, they involve a historian who we've covered in the last episode, Mr. Trevor Hugh Roper. His false authentication of the diaries led to him being one of the most renowned history to being disgraced within the discipline.
What a coincidence, isn't it? Today's episode also involves the journalist Gerd Heidemann, who passed away just last year on December 9, 2024. His life was interesting, to say the least. Heidemann is actually responsible for the publication of the Hitler diaries, making it one of the biggest scandals in the history of modern German journalism.
Well then, without further ado, let's dive into one of the most infamous hoaxes in modern history that entails forged documents, international scandal, and a whole lot of gullibility. This story is almost as wild as fiction itself. The story starts in the chaotic aftermath of World War II, but really gains traction in the late 20th century. By the early 1980s, Adolf Hitler had been dead for nearly 4 decades, yet his quote-unquote mystique and the horrors of his regime still fascinated journalists and the public alike.
Right, and with that fascination came an insatiable appetite for anything that could provide new insights into the man behind the atrocities. That's where the so-called Hitler diaries come into action.
The story begins with a man named Konrad Kujau, a German forger and con artist. Kujau had been forging Hitler's memorabilia for years. That includes paintings, letters, and even supposed personal items. He was known in certain circles for producing counterfeit Nazi artifacts, but no one expected him to attempt something on this scale.
And by scale, we mean an entire series of diaries allegedly written by Hitler himself. Kujau didn't just forge 1 or 2 pages. He created, believe it or not, 60 volumes of fake diaries, each one meticulously handwritten. Konrad Kujau wasn't just any forger, he was a skilled and audacious con artist with a long history of deception. Born in 1938 in Löbau, Germany, he grew up in the tumultuous years of the Second World War and its aftermath. From a young age, Kujau displayed a knack for forgery and opportunism.
That's right. Kujau started his career selling counterfeit Nazi memorabilia on a small scale, but by the 1970s he had made a name for himself, albeit a notorious one. As a dealer of fake relics from the Third Reich, these included paintings supposedly created by Hitler himself, personal letters written by Hitler himself, and even fake swastika emblazoned items.
His reputation as an extraordinary skilled forger made him a known figure in the underground world of collectors. But it was the Hitler diaries that cemented his infamy. Kujau didn't just intimate Hitler's handwriting, he immersed himself in Hitler's writings, speeches, and known quirks to produce what appeared to be an authentic record of the Führer's thoughts. Kujau had a knack for weaving integrated backstories to make his fakes seem authentic. He was known to spin elaborate tales of how he had come across these priceless artifacts, often claiming they had been smuggled out of East Germany or been recovered from hidden caches left behind by fleeing Nazis at the end of the Second World War and the downfall of the Third Reich.
Kujau claimed the diaries had been recovered from a plane crash in 1945 during the final days of the war. The story went that the plane supposedly carrying Hitler's personal belongings had gone down in East Germany and the diaries miraculously salvaged decades later.
It's really absurd to even think about this, isn't it, Kimberly? A plane crash coincidentally hiding a treasure trove of Hitler's personal thoughts? But at the time, it wasn't so far-fetched, given the chaos of the war's final days that saw the entire country in murderous turmoil.
That's right. The idea of a lost document from the Nazi era wasn't unusual. and Kuyao's forgeries were so well crafted, at least on the surface, that they fooled a lot of people. But we'll get to that. Let's talk about how the diaries came to light.
And now it is time for Gerd Heidemann, a journalist from the German magazine Stern, to enter the stage. Heidemann was very obsessed with Nazism, and that obsession went far beyond professional interest. He famously purchased Hermann Göring's yacht, the Karin II, and even hosted lavish parties on it, often attended by former members of the Nazi elite. It is also worth mentioning that, born in 1931, he was a member of the Hitler Youth, and between 1976 and 1981, he was dating Ada Göring, the only daughter of the former second-in-command of the Third Reich. So, in 1983, when he got wind of the supposed diaries, he clearly couldn't resist.
That sounds like an interesting character. Well, Heidemann believed that the diaries would be the scoop of the century. He convinced Stern to purchase the rights to the document for an astronomical sum, which was over 9 million German marks. That would be about tens of millions of euros in today's money.
And Stern wasn't the only party or medium interested in the diaries. Once word got out of this, major players like the Sunday Times in the UK and Newsweek in the US wanted in on the action. Everyone was eager to publish excerpts and capitalize on what seemed like an unparalleled historical finding.
The thing is, there were red flags from the very beginning. Historians and handwriting experts raised doubts, but the hype was so intense that many people just ignored them.
One major red flag, for example, was the content of the diaries themselves. Kuyao's Hitler wrote about the most mundane things: his diet, his struggles with indigestion, even his affection for his dog, Blondie. There was very little in the way of groundbreaking revelations about Adolf Hitler.
For documents supposedly penned by one of history's most infamous figures, they were shockingly bland, and yet people were desperate to believe they were authentic.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? There's something about the human psyche that makes us just want to believe in hidden truths, even when the evidence doesn't hold up.
And this willingness to believe played right into Kuyao's hands. Heidemann and Stern were so convinced, or maybe just so eager, that they bypassed proper authentication.
Well, not entirely though. Stern did hire a few experts to examine the diaries, but the process was very rushed and far from thorough. One of the most glaring oversights was the paper itself.
That's right. The paper and the ink used in the diaries were modern, something that should have been immediately obvious with a proper forensic analysis, but instead the expert focused on the handwriting, which was a near-perfect imitation of Hitler's.
Kuyao was meticulous in that sense. He studied Hitler's style, his phrasing, and even his misspellings. It was convincing enough to fool people who wanted to believe that the diaries were real.
But not everybody was fooled. Once the diaries were published, prominent historians like Hugh Trevor Roper, who initially vouched for them, quickly backtracked.
Trevor Roper's involvement is one of the most ironic parts of the story. He was a highly respected historian, known for his work on Nazi Germany, and yet even he fell for the hoax, at least temporarily.
To be fair, he later admitted that he'd been pressured to authenticate the diaries quickly so the story could break. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing scholarship for the sake of sensationalism.
And once the cracks started to show, they spread quickly. Forensic analysis finally confirmed what some had suspected all along. The diaries were totally fake, and with it, a hoax.
The paper contained modern chemicals, the bindings were machine-made, and even the monogrammed initials FH on the cover, meant to stand for Führer, Hitler, were completely fabricated.
And the shitstorm that followed after was indeed massive, to say the least. Stern faced international humiliation, Trevor Roper's reputation took a nosedive, and Heidemann and Kuyao both ended up in court.
Investigators discovered that Heidemann had embezzled a significant portion of the 9.3 Deutsche Mark, that's the amount Stern paid for the diaries, claiming that most of it had gone to Kuyao. However, the evidence suggested otherwise. He was arrested and in 1985 stood trial alongside Kuyao. The courtroom drama captivated Germany as Heidemann insisted he was just as much as a victim as anyone else.
Well, the court didn't buy that story. Heidemann was convicted of fraud and embezzlement and sentenced to 4 years and 8 months imprisonment. Kuyao, the mastermind forger, received a similar sentence.
That's absolutely insane. And by the time that Heidemann was released, his life and career were in shambles. Once a respected journalist known for his connections and flair for dramatic stories, he was now the infamous man who brought disgrace to Stern. His reputation as a journalist was irreparably damaged, and he struggled to rebuild his life.
Financial difficulties plagued him after his release. Unlike Kuyao, who managed to capitalize on his notoriety and as a forger through book deals and public appearances, Heidemann lived in relative obscurity. He reportedly lived modestly in Hamburg, far from the limelight he once craved.
In later interviews, Heidemann maintained his innocence, insisting he had been duped by Kuyao. He portrayed himself as a victim of his own ambition and a master con artist's lies. But for the public and the journalistic world, his name remains synonymous with one of the greatest embarrassments in publishing history.
The story of Gerd Heidemann is one of hubris and downfall. A man who dreamed of unearthing history but instead became entangled in a lie that destroyed his entire career and shadowed him for the rest of his life.
Kuyao, however, seemed to embrace his role as the eccentric trickster. His admission that he had created the diaries scribbled in his fake Hitler handwriting on old notebooks soaked in tea for authenticity was almost gleeful. He even joked during this trial, calling the forgeries art. After serving only 3 years of his sentence, he remained in the limelight. He opened up an art gallery in Stuttgart, and capitalizing on his reputation as the trickster and forger, he even started to create what was called the authentic fakes. But the Hitler diary fiasco wasn't just a bizarre footnote in history, it also reignited debates within academia and journalism. It highlighted the dangers of prioritizing sensationalism over rigorous scholarship.
Speaking of academia, the scandal also dovetails with the broader Goldhagen debate. Daniel Goldhagen's controversial book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, published in 1996, challenged conventional views on the Holocaust.
Goldhagen's thesis was as provocative as it was polarizing. He argued that the Holocaust wasn't simply the result of a small fanatical Nazi elite orchestrating atrocities, but rather the ordinary Germans who were deeply complicit. According to Goldhagen, widespread and culturally ingrained anti-Semitism along the German population made them willingly participate in genocide.
Exactly. Goldhagen didn't just implicate the SS or the Gestapo with his thesis. He claimed that regular Germans like teachers, farmers, policemen, or bureaucrats, which means normal civilian people, were active agents in the machinery of genocide, driven by what he termed eliminationist anti-Semitism. This, he argued, was a unique form of hatred that had pervaded German society long before Hitler came to power on January 31st, 1933. At the same time, he saw Hitler as the catalyst of it all predominantly. In his work, he also goes back to Mein Kampf, where he seeks clear proof that it was always Hitler's intention to actually commit the genocide on the European Jews.
His argument was certainly a new way to look at history compared to earlier scholarships. Before Goldhagen, much of the academic focus was on systemic factors, which included the structure of the Nazi state, the role of propaganda, and the hierarchical obedience that drove participation in atrocities. Historians like Christopher Browning, for example, argued in his book Ordinary Men that ordinary Germans participated in genocide not because of ingrained hatred, but because of peer pressure, fear of authority, and a gradual erosion of moral inhibitions.
Goldhagen rejected these explanations outright, accusing them of downplaying the role of individual agency and ideology. He insisted that cultural anti-Semitism wasn't just a backdrop to the Holocaust, it was the driving force that led to it. And Hitler was the one who enabled the German and Austrian people to unleash their supposedly indoctrinated hatred.
This sparked a huge debate within the academia. Critics accused Goldhagen of oversimplifying complex historical processes and ignoring the structural and coercive elements of the Nazi state, that the Holocaust was not the original plan per se, that it were the structures of Nazi Germany that led to the genocide first, had to be built, and that the final solution was not always the goal of the National Socialists.
But the defenders of Goldhagen, meanwhile, praised him for challenging entrenched narratives and forcing historians to face uncomfortable facts about the role of the ordinary people in the genocide. The Holocaust wasn't carried out in a vacuum, and his work reignited conversations about the cultural and psychological underpinnings of mass violence.
So this is where the connection to the Hitler diaries becomes so fascinating. Both the Goldhagen debate and the diaries highlight the enduring focus on Hitler as the central figure of the Nazi era. Whether through the diaries' fabricated insights into his personal life, or Goldhagen's analysis of the cultural climate that supported him, Hitler remains a point of obsession.
Right. The diaries fed into the public's desire to humanize or at least understand the man behind the Holocaust. But the machinery of the Nazi regime was vast, and it relied on countless individuals to carry out its atrocities.
You could even say that in some ways this obsession with Hitler is both understandable and limiting. On one hand, focusing on him as a singular figure allows us to channel our horror into a single, almost mythic villain. But on the other hand, it risks oversimplifying history and overlooking the systemic and collective nature of Nazi crimes.
Exactly. The Holocaust, the biggest and most horrific crime in the history of the entire world, wasn't just the work of one single man. It was the work of an entire society as a whole.
That's right. And the Goldhagen debate underscores the need to broaden our lens when studying the Holocaust. While Hitler's leadership and ideology were undeniably central, the willingness, or at least the complicity, of ordinary people played a critical role. Without them, the Nazi regime could not have functioned.
And yet, as the Hitler diary scandal clearly shows, the public, and even academia to some extent, often gravitates toward Hitler as a singular figure of fascination, whether it's his personal quirks, his supposed genius, or his monstrous capacity of evil. He dominates our understanding of the Nazi era. You could even argue that he is the Nazi era.
And I guess the focus on Hitler isn't entirely a bad thing. After all, he was the architect of the Nazi state, and his vision shaped his policies. But by fixating on him, we risked ignoring the broader apparatus that enabled his vision to actually become a reality.
You're totally right, Kimberly, and that's the central key point of the argument. Understanding the Holocaust, and with it also the complete Nazi era, requires us to move beyond the theory of the great man in history. The diaries, as absurd as they were, are a symptom of this larger problem. They fed into a narrative that reduces the complexities of the Third Reich to the personality of one singular man, Adolf Hitler.
And that's exactly why debates like Goldhagen's are so important, not only for the scholarship, but also just between you and me. They challenge us to rethink the role of ordinary people in extraordinary events and to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't just come from the top, it seeps into every single layer of society.
Well said, Kimberly. The Hitler diaries may have been a hoax, but they serve as a reminder of our dangerous fascination with supposedly great men.
I guess the bottom line is history fascinates and captivates the public, especially so it seems the more grotesque parts of it. And this is what the lesson here is. Fascination can lead to gullibility, ignoring red flags, and accepting what seems highly unlikely after looking more closely.
Well, I would say another episode, another lie uncovered.
And with that, let's wrap up this episode of Great Lies in History. And just wait and see about what great lie we will talk about next week. See you then. Stay tuned.